In this video, I'm going to list the most used development tools for blockchain in 2020. I'm only going to talk about the blockchain development tools that I actually use. It's going to cover smart contract, front-end, and also deployment. On my YouTube channel, Eat the Blogs, I have tutorials for many of the tools that I'm going to mention in this video, so check out the links in the description. If you don't know me, I'm Julian, and on my channel Eat the Blogs, I teach blockchain development and how to find your first blockchain job. First, we're going to start with the tool for smart contract development. Solidity is the most popular programming language for smart contract. Its syntax looks like JavaScript, but actually under the hood it's quite different. There are different versions of Solidity, but the one that is up to date in 2020 is Solidity 0.6. If you want to learn Solidity, I have a very popular video series on my channel. Another tool that I find very useful is Remix. Remix is an online IDE for coding Solidity smart contract. That's very good as a playground when you want to try out new feature of Solidity, and that's also very good for learning. That's very beginner friendly. You just have to go to the website, nothing to install, and boom, right away you can start coding smart contract. Then once you start to have smart contracts that are a bit more complex, you probably want to use a framework like Truffle. Truffle is the most popular framework for Solidity smart contract. This is basically a Node.js CLI tool, and with this you can easily deploy your smart contract, interact with them, and test them. It's still possible to code advanced smart contract without Truffle, but that would require you to piece together many different tools. So I really don't recommend it. Really, if you want to save yourself some trouble, just use Truffle. And if you want to see more practical examples for using Truffle, check out my introduction to Truffle video on my channel. Then I really like to use Truffle boxes. Truffle boxes are pre-configured Truffle project that you can use to kickstart your smart contract. So you have Truffle boxes for different integration. For example, you have a Truffle box for React, for Vue. So that's really the fastest way to get started. Then there is a tool called Ganache. Ganache is a local development blockchain. This is used to develop your smart contract locally without having to interact on the real Ethereum blockchain, because it costs money and it can be risky and it can be slow. So when we develop smart contract, we just want to have a safe sandbox, and Ganache provides this safe sandbox. By the way, as you can notice, this is also built by the people who also built the Truffle framework. So there is a very nice integration between Ganache and Truffle, and actually when you install Truffle, Ganache is already installed as well, so you don't need to install it separately. So Ganache comes in two flavors. So one version of Ganache is called Ganache GUI, and it has a nice visual interface, but personally I prefer CLI tool, so I use the other version of Ganache, which is Ganache CLI. And so I just use the CLI version in my terminal. But you can try both versions and see which one you prefer. If you're on the GUI version, then you can install it on this link. Otherwise, if you install the NPM package, it's going to install the CLI version. And if you want to go deeper in Ganache, I actually have a full series on my channel. Then there is a Solidity library that is called OpenZipLink. OpenZipLink has a standard implementation for major token standard like ERC20, ERC721, and other goodies. So instead of rebuilding all your smart contract from scratch, first check out OpenZipLink to see if they have anything that can help you. So here, this is the GitHub page, but when you want to use OpenZipLink in your Truffle project, you need to use the NPM package. And if you want to learn more about how to use OpenZipLink in your Solidity smart contract, you can check out my series on OpenZipLink on my channel. There is also another package of OpenZipLink that I like, and that's called OpenZipLink Test Helpers. So when you develop a Solidity smart contract, it's very important to test thoroughly your smart contract, because after you deploy your smart contract to the blockchain, it's absolutely impossible to do any update to the code. So you really need to make sure that everything works perfectly. And when you start to test your Solidity smart contract, you will realize that if you want to test certain things, you need to write some boilerplate code. For example, if you want to test that a transaction has failed, that's a little bit annoying. Also, in some case, you want to do some time travel on the blockchain. So these are all utility functions that are provided by OpenZipLink Test Helpers. If you want to learn how you can test your Solidity smart contract, I have a tutorial on my channel. Next, there is a little package that is called Solhint. So that's basically a linter for your Solidity code. If you don't know what's a linter, that's basically a formatter for your code that can enforce a certain code style. So you might think that that's not super important, but actually for readability, that can really bring a lot. And it can also detect some security vulnerability. So if you're working in a team, you absolutely need to use a linter like Solhint, but even if you work alone, just to improve the quality of your code, this also can be very beneficial. And also you can be sure that recruiters that look at your GitHub profile will really notice that sort of detail. Next, there is a tool that is called Solidity Coverage, and that's used when you test your smart contract to make sure that you have enough coverage. So coverage basically is a percentage that tell you what's the part of your smart contract that is covered by tests. And ideally, we want the coverage to be 100%. So every time you run your test, Solidity Coverage is going to compute your coverage and tell you, well, with all your tests, you cover 95%, 96%, etc. And after, if you really want to be fancy, you can even configure continuous integration tool to refuse merging some branches if the coverage is not above a certain threshold. And that's something that we actually did for one of the company at which I used to work. And so when this happened, then I will have to add some tests to increase the coverage and resubmit my pull request, and only then it will be accepted. Then another package I like is called ETH Gas Reporter. That's basically a profiler for the gas consumption in your smart contract. So typically the way you use it is that every time you run your test, it's going to profile the different function in your Solidity smart contract and give you the gas consumption for each. And so this way you can spot which function consume too much gas and decide to do some optimization. Then there is a security tool that is called Mithril. So Mithril can detect some common security vulnerability in your smart contract. So typically you want to run Mithril every time you change the code of your smart contract and detect as early as possible any vulnerability and fix it. So you can run Mithril directly on your computer, or you can use the API, which is called MythX, I think. And there is another security tool that is called Slither that you can also use. So there is actually a difference in the way they work and the kind of vulnerability they find, but I'm not an expert in this. And I know that in general, smart contract projects just use both of them, so I just do the same. So now we're going to start to talk of frontend and integration with smart contract. So the most used framework for the front end of your decentralized application is React. You can try to do decentralized application without using React and by directly manipulating the DOM, but it's probably going to result quickly in spaghetti code because in general, decentralized applications are very interactive. So I strongly recommend to use a framework like React. You don't have to absolutely use React. If you want, you can use some other front-end framework like Vue or Angular, but most blockchain companies will have need for React skills, and in general, the development tools for front-end generally tend to be more compatible with React than with other libraries. Then we have Web3. Web3 is a JavaScript library that is very used for decentralized application. It can work on the front end, but also on the back end. So we use Web3 to interact with the Ethereum blockchain and with your smart contract. You don't strictly need Web3. If you want, you can choose to interact directly with the Ethereum API, but it's not very easy to do this. So Web3 really abstract away a lot of low-level detail about the API of Ethereum. So I highly recommend to use Web3 if you want to interact with your smart contract. There is a caveat with Web3. There are basically two different APIs. So Web3 1.0 and above has a certain API, and below 1.0 it's different. So every time you check out tutorial, make sure that they are up to date. Actually, on my channel, I have a full series on Web3, and that's up to date with the latest version of Web3. Then there is a framework that is called Drizzle. Drizzle is a JavaScript framework for the front end of your decentralized application. It works especially well with React, but there is also an adapter for Vue. It allows to very easily integrate with your smart contract by building an internal store that represents the state of your smart contract, but in a Redux store. And you can just connect to this Redux store and keep your React component up to date. Otherwise, if you don't use Drizzle, a typical problem that can happen in decentralized application is that you send a transaction to the smart contract, so you modify its data, but another part of your UI is not up to date. It still has the old version of the data because you haven't thought of refreshing that part of the UI. So with Drizzle, you never have this problem. It just takes care of keeping all the components up to date. By the way, the API of Drizzle changed a lot since it was created. So currently you want to use the latest API, which is with React hooks. And I have a video about this in my series on Web3. Then we have MetaMask. So MetaMask is the most popular Ethereum wallet for decentralized application. This is a Chrome and Firefox extension, so users have to install it before using decentralized applications. It is responsible for storing the private keys of user and signing transactions. Typically, the way it works is that user will click on a button of your decentralized application, then they will see a pop-up of MetaMask that asks them to confirm that they really want to send a transaction with a certain parameter. They click on confirm, it signs the transaction and send it to the Ethereum network. The tricky part is to integrate MetaMask with Web3, and I actually have a tutorial on that on my series on Web3. Then I also often use Jest. So Jest is a JavaScript library to run your tests. That's a little bit like Mocha, but it's a bit more modern. And I use it to test my React components, and I use it with another library that is called React Testing Library. So this is not strictly for blockchain. This is something that you would use for any front-end project. So React Testing Library is for doing unit testing of specific component, but if you want to do integration testing and see how the whole app interact together, then you can use another tool that is called Cypress. For example, with Cypress, you can simulate when a user clicks on a button, and you can make sure that the rest of the UI behave the correct way. Okay, so that's it for front-end development tools. So now we're gonna move on to deployment. In general, decentralized applications are front-end heavy, and sometimes you don't have any backend, you just have your JavaScript front-end. So in this case, you just need to deploy some static assets, so your HTML, your JavaScript, and maybe some images. And in order to do this very simply, you can use a tool called Netlify. So with Netlify, you can just drag and drop all your front-end assets, and boom, automatically it will make them available. No need to configure any server. And you can also set up continuous integration with Git very easily. If your decentralized application also has a backend, in this case, you can use Heroku. So Heroku is a famous platform for deploying applications very easily. So with Heroku, you don't manage server directly, but they give you high-level abstraction where you can just push your code and they just manage the rest. It automatically runs on their server. So although it's very easy to use, the counterparty is, of course, Heroku tends to be way more expensive than other solutions that are lower level, like managing your own server on DigitalOcean. But in general, it's still worth it to pay a little bit more and save some developer time. Another tool you will need for deploying your smart contract is Infura. So Infura is an API that exposes endpoint that you can use to interact with the Ethereum network. Without Infura, you would need to run your own Ethereum node to deploy on mainnet, and it consumes a lot of disk. I think like currently the Ethereum blockchain is more than 1 terabyte. And so that would be very expensive to do this. Also, sometimes technically that's also not very easy. It can take several days to synchronize the full blockchain, and sometimes there are some weird errors, and you don't necessarily want to waste your time fixing that sort of problem. So by using Infura, you just use the API, you send your transaction to mainnet, and they take care of the rest. They run their own Ethereum node. You don't have to do anything. So they have a free plan that is more than necessary for most blockchain applications, but if you have higher requirements, they also have a paid plan. One thing is a bit confusing about Infura. In general, you only need it when you want to deploy your smart contract to the blockchain or interact with your smart contract, but as an administrator. However, end user, they will connect to the blockchain by using MetaMask, and MetaMask has its own way of sending transaction to the blockchain, but it will not use your Infura connection. Another tool that I use is GitHub Action. So with GitHub Action, you can set up continuous integration in GitHub exactly like on GitLab. If you don't know what is continuous integration, that's basically a synonym for automation. Every time you push some code with Git, you can trigger some automatic action. So typically in a blockchain application, you want to run all the tests of your smart contract to make sure that nothing is broken. Before, if you wanted to do this, you needed to do some third-party integration with other services like Circle CI. But then GitLab started to introduce a very simple way to do it with a YAML configuration file, and then GitHub after copied this feature from GitLab. And so with GitHub Action, you just have to configure a file in YAML and you can specify the different command that you want to run every time you push your code to GitHub. And another tool you might want to use with this is Docker, because sometimes when you run your test with GitHub Action, then you want to isolate the process that run the test in a Docker container. That's not obligatory, but that's a possibility if you run into some issue when you set this up. Next, we're going to see what are the blockchain development tools for Ethereum network. So before you deploy your smart contract to the real Ethereum network, first you want to deploy it to what we call a public testnet. A public testnet is a public Ethereum network that everybody can access, but contrary to the real Ethereum network, it doesn't manipulate real Ether. It manipulates fake Ether, and everything that happens on this public testnet is completely independent from the real Ethereum network. So that's a safe playground where you can test your smart contract before deploying to production. In order to use a public testnet, you need to have some fake Ether. So there are several public testnets, and for each of them, there is a tool called a faucet that distributes for free some fake Ether. All you have to do is to copy paste your address. You click on a button and it will send you this fake Ether. So for example, this is the faucet of Kovan, so it's going to give you fake Ether for the Kovan network, but you also have other public testnet like Robston, like Rinkeby, and each of them have their own faucet. So the next tool I want to show you is Etherscan. Etherscan is a blockchain explorer for Ethereum. So for example, you can inspect a specific transaction if you know the transaction hash. So if you scroll down, you will see the latest transaction. So for example, for this transaction, you can see the transaction hash, the block, when it was mined, the timestamp, the sending address, the recipient, the amount of Ether that was transferred, as well as the transaction fee. You can also inspect smart contract by address, or you can also type directly, for example, the DICE stable coin. So this is an address of a smart contract, so the info will be a little bit different. You can read the value from the smart contract. It's also possible to read the source code of the contract. And so Etherscan has a feature to verify the source code. So by doing this, you can be sure that the smart contract at a certain address has actually the source code that they claim to have. So what's the importance of Etherscan for decentralized application? So in your dApp, after a user confirms a transaction, your dApp needs to show a link to Etherscan so that the user can inspect your transaction in Etherscan independently of your dApp. Another thing you need to know about Etherscan is that you have a subdomain for each public testnet. So the default version etherscan.io is for mainnet, but if you prefix this by, for example, kovan.etherscan.io, this will be for the Kovan network, etc. Another tool that is useful is ethgasstation.info. This website gives you the market price of a gas price currently in the Ethereum network. So if you have a dApp in production, you probably want to monitor gas prices, and maybe that when gas prices are too high, maybe that you want to temporarily disable your dApp or take some action. Another tool that is interesting is ethstats.io. So that's basically a dashboard for the Ethereum network. So this can be useful to see when the network is congested, for example. And actually, I have a video that shows you how to analyze this dashboard. So now I'd like to tell you about cool tools that I haven't tried yet, but I would like to try in the future. So one of them is Truffle Teams by the creator of the Truffle framework. Truffle Teams is a tool to manage and monitor your smart contract on Ethereum. It basically gives you a visual interface that can help you to manage all the different addresses of all your smart contracts. So if you're just getting started in Ethereum, maybe that it's not obvious to understand the value of this, but once you start to have couple of smart contracts in production, very quickly you will realize that you need to manage a lot of different addresses and it gets messy really quickly. So Truffle teams allow you to put some order into this and to manage your smart contracts in a clean way. Then another cool stuff I like to try is Faultmatic. Faultmatic is a modern Ethereum wallet. So currently the most used Ethereum wallet is MetaMask, but a lot of users complain that it's not very user friendly. So Faultmatic wants to address these problems. So it works with the API, so you don't need to install any browser extensions, and also you don't need to remember any seed phrases. Users create an account with their email or with their phone number, and they have a system to keep it secure. They also have a nice SDK that make it really easy to integrate in your decentralized application. So I'm really excited to try that. Another cool project is 3box. So 3box want to solve the problem of identity on Ethereum. So on 3box, end users are able to create their decentralized profile, and after they can decide which decentralized application is able to access which part of their profile. So that seems pretty cool. Another cool project is OpenZeppelin SDK. So this is different from OpenZeppelin, the Solidity library that I showed you before. OpenZeppelin SDK allows you to have updatable smart contract, and it works with proxy smart contracts. Another cool project is The Graph. The Graph is a GraphQL API over Ethereum. With this API, you are able to read data from any smart contract using GraphQL. So if you are into GraphQL and Ethereum, definitely check this out. Then there is Dune Analytics. Dune Analytics is an analytics platform for Ethereum. It allows you to understand what's going on in smart contract. For example, one of my clients used it in order to gather some user data in order to decide what kind of feature he will build for his DeFi product. So you can write your query in SQL and you can see the result in nice graphs. For example, one of my clients who is building a DeFi product used this in order to understand the market and to decide which feature it's going to build. There is another similar project which is called Alice.io. So what makes Alice.io very special is that you can actually monitor your smart contract and set up some real-time alerts when certain events happen on the blockchain. For example, that can help you to understand that there are many failed transactions with your smart contract, and so potentially there is a problem. Then we have another project called Matic. So Matic is great if you want to have real-time updates from the blockchain. And basically it exposes an API that notifies you when an event happens on the blockchain. So here, when I talk about event, I talk about native Ethereum events that you can emit in your smart contract. You can listen to this event without Matic, without any API, but it can be a little bit tricky and sometimes it's not very reliable. So Matic builds a reliable API to listen to these events, and you don't have to deal with the detail of the Ethereum API itself. Another cool project is called Biconomy. In a nutshell, Biconomy allows you to do meta transactions that are also known as gasless transactions. That means that your user just need to sign transaction data. They send the transaction to the API of Biconomy, and then you are going to pay for the gas cost, not the end user. So that can make your dApp much more user-friendly. Another tool I like to try is Socrates. So Socrates is a framework for using zero-knowledge proof on Ethereum. This basically addresses the problem of privacy on the blockchain. However, it doesn't seem super easy to use, so that would be my only complaint. So now I'm going to tell you about alternative tools. So these libraries are not as popular as the one I mentioned before, but they still exist, so it's good to know about them. So for example, if you don't like Web3, you can have a look at Ether.js, which is an alternative to Web3 with a different API. Next, if you don't like the Truffle framework, you can have a look at Embark, which is an alternative smart contract framework for Ethereum. It's also written in Node.js, so if you are used to Node.js with Truffle, then you should have no problem understanding Embark. Another alternative to Truffle is dApp.tools. That's a set of CLI tools that allow you to develop Ethereum smart contract, and this is actually used by MakerDAO, which are the creator of the DAI stablecoin. If you are into Python, you can also check out Brownie, which is basically a Python-based framework for developing Ethereum smart contract. You can also check out the Python version of Web3, web3.py. So this allows you to interact with the Ethereum blockchain, but using the technology of Python. So for example, if you are into Django, you can use the Django REST framework if you want to build API for Ethereum using Python, or you can use Flask. And there is also an alternative language for smart contract called Viper. Viper is focused on security and simplicity, and its syntax is very close to Python. And actually, if you want to learn Viper, I have a tutorial on it on my channel. Okay, so next I'm going to move on to general development tools that are not specific to blockchain. So I do my blockchain development on macOS. So generally speaking, is one of the best operating systems for web development, and blockchain development builds on top of web development. So it also makes sense that macOS is pretty good for that. Any flavor of Linux is also a good option. So Ubuntu, Fedora, etc. And nowadays, actually, you can also develop blockchain application on Windows. However, you might run into some problem if you use some advanced library for blockchain on Windows. So in this case, you might look into set up a dual boot Windows Linux on your machine, for example. And I also have a video that talks about blockchain development on Windows. Then I also use Node.js, so that's because a lot of blockchain development tools are based on Node.js, such as the Truffle framework. So Node.js is absolutely cross-platform. It can run equally well on Mac, Linux, or Windows. Make sure you have installed the LTS version here, long-term support. Then I use a tool that is called Tmux, so that's a terminal multiplexer that allow me to split my terminal window into different parts. So that's very useful when I work on a smart contract project. So for example, in one window, I run a blockchain. In another window, I run the terminal command. And in this other window, I use my code editor, which leads me to the next tool that I use, Vim. I use Vim, which is a modal code editor in order to do all my development. So Vim is really not for everybody and certainly not for beginner. But the big advantage of Vim is that you never touch your mouse. You only use your keyboards. So not only you are very fast, but you also reduce the stress on your finger and on your joints. And that will protect you against some joint disease such as RSI. By the way, if you are interested in Vim and Tmux, I have a video on Blogs where I explain how I combine Tmux and Vim to make it a blockchain IDE, so check it out. So as I said, I don't recommend Vim for beginner. Probably that most of you will be better off with Visual Studio Code. And you can also install the Solidity extension if you want to have syntax highlighting for Solidity. Then on my Mac, I also use Brew. So Brew is a package manager for macOS. It makes it really simple to install different packages. Of course, I use version control and Git. So if you work in a team, for sure you will need Git, but even as a solo developer, Git helps you a lot. And not only for version control actually, but also for deployment or for saving your code. And you don't need to use any of Git complex feature. You can just start by doing something very simple. You just commit and push, and that's it. Okay, so now I'm going to talk of tools that you probably don't need, because there are a lot of tutorials that recommend you some crazy tools that are either outdated or totally not adapted to blockchain. So in order to avoid wasting your time, make sure to follow this section. There used to be an Ethereum dApp browser called Mist. So that was great when it just came out, but Mist is super old school and it's been discontinued, so you don't need to worry about Mist. Then there is an Ethereum client that is called Geth, and it's written in Go, and I've seen a couple of tutorials that recommend to use this Ethereum client in order to learn smart contract development. And I think that this is really a terrible advice, because basically Geth is a good client for production. So for example, if you were running a service like Infra, like I mentioned before, then you could use an Ethereum client like Geth. But if you're just doing some smart contract development, it's much better to use a developer-friendly Ethereum client like Ganache. Then you probably don't need to install yourself the compiler of Solidity, which is called Solc. Solc is already embedded in other tools such as Truffle. Then in order to deploy your decentralized application, you probably don't need to use AWS. So AWS usually is suitable for companies that have a complex setup, that want to scale, that have a big backend. but in the case of decentralized applications, usually the backend is very small, so it's not really worth it to go through the pain of using AWS, which is not very simple, just to deploy a very simple backend that will just serve the front end of your dApp. You're much better off with alternatives such as Heroku or Netlify that I mentioned before. Another thing you might not need for your dApp is a database like MySQL or PostgreSQL. So like I just said, decentralized applications usually have very small backend, and usually the data of your decentralized application live in a smart contract on the blockchain. So in a way, the smart contract replaces the database. So you can probably forget about databases for your decentralized application. So there is a tool that I mentioned before, that's Docker. So I said that I use it in a very specific context. Sometimes I use it for continuous integration in order to run a local development blockchain and run the test. But that's a very specific use case. And apart from this, I don't really need to use Docker for my decentralized application, and certainly not to deploy the backend, which usually is very simple. So I would say that for most decentralized application, Docker is a little bit overkill. I also think that you don't really need to use Redux if you use React for the front end of your dApp. And the reason is because nowadays with the new API of React, so React hooks, you can pretty much reproduce the same functionality as Redux, but in a much more simple way. So out of all the tools that I mentioned, please let me know which tool has been the hardest to use and which one has been the easiest. Let me know in the comments down below. So that's it for this long list of blockchain development tools. Of course, you don't need to know all of them. You can experiment with a new tool from time to time, but don't feel the need to use everything. See you in another video. Bye bye.